In the next few moments, we are going to find out how the man who shot Hamilton went from the vice presidency to planning an empire to dying almost completely forgotten, and it all started right after that duel. So, Aaron Burr, one of the most infamous men in all of American history. He was responsible for killing the very man who had created and shaped our financial systems. The musical and book entitled Hamilton goes over the rivalry between the two quite well. I am the most familiar with the decade-old musical rather than the book, as are most people these days, but if you haven't had a chance to watch it, it is very insightful and I highly recommend you do. It is currently streaming on Disney+. Anyways, the duel takes place July 11th, 1804, and it ends with Hamilton dying and Burr coming away unscathed. At least physically speaking, because his public image was forever tarnished. Burr expected to be hailed a hero for defending his honor, but the country was outraged that he had killed the beloved and arrogant Alexander Hamilton. The duel had taken place in New Jersey, but Hamilton died in New York, so both states brought murder charges against Burr. And instead of taking the charges head on, Burr avoided both states and spent most of his time in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. Something to keep in mind here is that despite having just murdered a United States citizen, Aaron Burr was still the vice president. It is important to note here that back then, the runner-up for president was made the vice president. Jefferson despised Burr and kept him locked out of almost all the presidential affairs. And so Burr spent most of his time at the Capitol presiding over Senate sessions and impeachment trials. Burr continued to preside over these things even after the duel. The last official decision Burr had as VP was an impeachment trial against Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase. You see, Samuel Chase was a Federalist and had previously endorsed John Adams as a president. And President Jefferson did not like that a judge on the Supreme Court opposed him. Jefferson brought the charges before Chase and prosecuted him. It is at this point where we see how Burr wasn't an entirely evil person, but a man who believed in justice and America. Both critics and allies alike praised Burr's unwavering fairness towards both the prosecution and the defense. Even though Jefferson had pressured him to make sure Chase was charged, Burr, who was still a fugitive, held on to what he had fought for and the beliefs that had founded America. Justice Samuel Chase was not charged, and shortly after the trial, Burr wasn't the vice president anymore. Burr's murder charges had been dropped in both New York City and New Jersey. But he was in a stalemate, with no more legal moves. And when you don't have any more moves, that's when you decide to make your own game. Burr realized that there was nothing else left for him in the East Coast. In 1805, he moved his sights westward into the newly acquired Louisiana territories, where he hatched a plan to become an emperor. When you say something like that nowadays, people can't help but laugh at you. But for a man with no prospects and even fewer friends, it was the kind of Hail Mary he needed. Or at least that's what he thought. Burr met a general in the United States Army named James Wilkinson. General Wilkinson was on the Spanish payroll and was a co-conspirator to Burr. Burr was contacting British officials and Mexican revolutionaries, hoping that they would be willing to fight for a new nation in North America, one with an army and ambitions that deterred people from committing to Burr. It is said that Burr talked about taking the Louisiana Territory and joining it with Mexico, or maybe even marching troops from the new country to Washington, D.C. and capturing it. Regardless of which plan was real, it threatened the US. But these rumors found their way to President Jefferson, who had just been reelected. Jefferson couldn't act on it quite yet because there wasn't enough evidence, but ultimately the plans and thoughts were too extreme for General Wilkinson. The general betrayed Burr and told Jefferson that the former vice president was planning to hurt the US by taking territory. Without hesitation, Jefferson called for the immediate arrest of Aaron Burr. Burr was arrested and prosecuted for treason, and the punishment for treason was execution. Burr would be a dead man if convicted. The trial took place in Richmond, Virginia, and towards the end of the trial, the justice in charge of the case found very little evidence of treason from Burr. And the fact that Burr hadn't even taken any action against the US government made it hard to fully prosecute, because back then, in order to prosecute for treason, there needed to be an action against the government, and there simply wasn't. The justice dropped the charges and Burr was free to go. What little honor and reputation Burr had before was completely stripped from him following the trial. And the final chapter of his life remains one of the saddest and most lonely in American history. After everything, the duel, the politics, and the trial, Aaron Burr exiled himself to Europe. And when he finally came back, almost no one cared. He went to Europe trying to find investors to help him start his own country. And while doing this, he lived in near poverty, just looking for the next meal. For whatever reason, he was adamant that a North American empire could work. When he finally gave up and decided to return to New York City, he took a fake name and went back to his law practice. He died with a massive debt in 1836. Burr often gets overlooked for the positive effects of his political career. He was a firm believer in free speech and free press. Also, he believed that all citizens should have the right to vote, women and immigrants as well as slaves. In fact, he was one of the first abolitionists. So through all his scheming and missteps, there was a man who had been there in the beginning who just wanted to see justice and liberty flourish, but he took his eyes off the ball and his life ended in debt and forgotten. Burr's story proves not just that history isn't black and white, but that speaking out or acting out could destroy your life in early America. The crazy thing is that he wasn't the only one who paid the price for challenging power. In fact, there was a law passed just a few years prior that got people arrested just for criticizing the government. And that's the story I tell in my next video. You won't want to miss it, so click here.